The cafe buzzed around us, but I could hardly focus on anything beyond Liam's steady gaze and the warm pressure of his knee against mine. Every accidental touch, every lingering look, seemed to crack open a door I hadn't realized I was standing in front of. He didn't pull away, and neither did I, as though we both silently agreed to let this tension simmer between us, testing the boundaries of what felt like a dangerous but thrilling possibility. "So," he said, his voice quieter now, his hand toying absently with his coffee cup, "do you ever think about the old days? Back when you and Daniel were practically inseparable?" I laughed, a little uneasy under his intense scrutiny. "More often than you'd think. Those were some of the best times of my life." He smiled, a hint of something deeper flickering in his eyes. "Yeah. I remember you coming over all the time, practically part of the family." I felt a warmth in my chest at the thought. "Yeah, you guys made me feel like I belonged." He nodded, his gaze holding mine. "Maybe that's because you did." I looked away, trying to shake the sensation of his words settling over me like a blanket I couldn't escape. But when I glanced back, I saw that he was still watching me, his eyes filled with an openness that felt almost vulnerable. After a pause, he reached across the table, his hand grazing mine. It was a small touch, so subtle that anyone around us might not have even noticed, but to me, it felt like an earthquake. His fingers were warm, steady, and as they brushed over mine, my pulse quickened, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't pull my hand away. Instead, I found myself leaning into the touch, allowing my fingers to intertwine with his in a way that felt both forbidden and exhilarating. "I'm glad you're here," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cafe. "Me too," I replied, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Just then, Daniel's voice broke through the bubble we'd created, pulling us abruptly back into the reality we'd managed to ignore for the past hour. He reappeared with a broad smile, completely oblivious to the tension hanging between his brother and me. Quickly, Liam and I pulled our hands apart, the moment dissolving in an instant, but I could still feel the lingering heat of his touch. We spent the rest of the afternoon in Daniel's company, the three of us laughing and catching up, but my attention was split, my focus drifting again and again to Liam. Every time our gazes met, there was a spark, a reminder of the moment we'd shared, and I felt myself drawn to him in a way that was impossible to ignore. Finally, as evening fell and the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel invited me back to their apartment for drinks. I hesitated, feeling the weight of the tension between Liam and me, but curiosity got the better of me. I agreed, and soon the three of us were settled in their cozy living room, laughter and conversation flowing freely as the night wore on. At some point, Daniel stepped out to take a call, leaving me alone with Liam once again. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we hadn't said, everything we'd only hinted at in those stolen moments throughout the day. Liam leaned closer, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I was hoping we'd get a moment alone," he murmured, his voice low, a hint of something dark and enticing in his tone. My breath caught, a nervous thrill surging through me. "Yeah?" He nodded, his hand finding its way to my knee, a gentle pressure that made my heart race. "There's something I need to tell you." I swallowed, feeling my pulse quicken as his fingers brushed along my knee, tracing slow, deliberate circles that sent warmth radiating up my leg. "What is it?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering over my face as if searching for something. "Back in the day, when you'd come over all the time, I used to watch you. You and Daniel would hang out and I'd be in the background pretending not to notice you, but—" He trailed off, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite name. A surge of heat rushed to my cheeks, my heart pounding as I took in his words. "You noticed me." His gaze softened, his fingers tightening slightly on my knee. "More than noticed. I wanted you to notice me, too." I could feel the weight of his confession settling over me, a heady mix of surprise, disbelief, and exhilaration. I'd spent so long thinking that any feelings I had for Liam were one-sided, a foolish crush I'd buried for the sake of keeping the peace. But now, here he was, admitting that he'd felt it too, that there had always been something simmering between us, hidden in plain sight. Before I could respond, his hand slid up, his fingers brushing along my thigh, and a thrill shot through me, the closeness of him overwhelming. I leaned in, my hand finding its way to his shoulder, and before I could second-guess myself, our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss that sent a surge of electricity through me. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, but as our hands found each other, as his fingers tangled in my hair, it deepened, growing more fervent, more intense. I felt his hand slip to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, his breath warm against my skin. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and so intensely real that I could hardly believe it was happening. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, I looked into his eyes, seeing my own emotions reflected back at me. Hope, desire, and a deep, unspoken connection that felt as old as time. "Liam," I began, my voice a whisper filled with the weight of everything I wanted to say. But before I could finish, Daniel's footsteps echoed down the hallway, breaking the moment like a fragile glass shattering against stone. We scrambled apart, our faces flushed, our breaths still coming in rapid gasps. When Daniel re-entered the room, he looked at us with a bemused expression, clearly sensing the charged atmosphere but unaware of its cause. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, with Liam and me exchanging furtive glances, our stolen moment lingering between us like a secret we could barely contain. And as I left their apartment that night, my mind was filled with thoughts of him, of his touch, his gaze, the unspoken promise that hung between us, waiting to be fulfilled. The drive home was a haze of memories and sensations. I could still feel the warmth of Liam's hand on my knee, the intensity of his gaze, the soft pressure of his lips against mine. The stolen moment replayed over and over in my mind, filling me with a mix of exhilaration and a nervous ache that I couldn't shake. When I finally lay down that night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the way his confession had changed everything between us, opening a door I hadn't even known was there. The following days were torture. I wanted to text him, to see him again, to relive those fleeting seconds of closeness, but the weight of what had happened, and the complications it could bring, held me back. I tried to focus on my usual routine, throwing myself into work and filling my days with anything that would keep my mind off Liam. But nothing worked. He lingered in the corners of my thoughts, always there, just beneath the surface. Finally, after a few days of silence, my phone lit up with a message from him. My heart pounded as I read his words, simple but loaded with meaning. "Can we talk? I need to see you." I hesitated, the weight of my own uncertainty pressing down on me, but I knew that ignoring him would only make things worse. I replied with a quick, "Yeah, let's meet," and we arranged to meet at a quiet park nearby, away from prying eyes and familiar faces. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against a tree, his gaze distant as he stared at the ground. I approached slowly, my nerves coiling tighter with every step, and when he looked up, the intensity in his eyes made my heart skip. We stood there in silence for a moment, neither of us quite sure how to begin, until he took a step forward, his hand reaching for mine. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he admitted, his voice a low murmur that seemed to echo in the quiet park. "I don't know what this is, but I know it's real." My breath caught, a thrill of warmth spreading through me as his hand tightened around mine. I searched his gaze, finding the same vulnerability and uncertainty I felt, the same unspoken longing that had lingered between us for years. "I feel it too," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. "But this is complicated. Daniel. Everything." He nodded, his gaze dropping as his thumb traced slow circles against my palm. I know, but I can't just ignore this. I don't want to. The sincerity in his voice struck something deep within me, breaking through the layers of doubt and fear that had held me back. I felt a surge of determination, a willingness to face whatever challenges lay ahead, as long as it meant being with him. I don't want to ignore it either, I said softly, my hand tightening around his. But we need to be careful. If we're going to do this, it has to be real. We can't afford to hurt each other or anyone else. He nodded, a look of resolve settling over him as he stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup my face. It's real for me, he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. And I want this, us, to be more than just a moment. Before I could respond, his lips met mine in a slow, tender kiss that left me breathless. It wasn't the hurried, stolen kiss we'd shared in his apartment. This was something deeper, something filled with the promise of things yet to come. His hands found their way to my shoulders, pulling me closer as the world around us faded into a quiet hum, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the soft, reassuring pressure of his lips. When we finally pulled apart, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, a certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. We spent the next few hours walking through the park, talking quietly about our past, our fears, and the path we were about to walk. Every touch, every glance felt like an affirmation of the connection we'd found, a connection that felt as fragile as it was profound. As the evening approached, we finally parted ways, each of us feeling the weight of what lay ahead but filled with a cautious hope. We knew that the road before us wouldn't be easy, that there would be moments of doubt and fear, but for the first time, we were willing to take the risk. Over the next few weeks, we saw each other whenever we could, our time together filled with stolen moments and quiet confessions. We kept our relationship a secret, not wanting to risk the fallout with Daniel or anyone else until we were certain of what we had. Each encounter felt like a revelation, a chance to explore the depth of our connection in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. One evening, as we lay together in the quiet warmth of my apartment, I felt the weight of our decision settle over me. Liam's hand was entwined with mine, his breathing steady as he traced gentle circles along my palm. I looked over at him, my heart swelling with a mix of love, fear, and hope. "Do you ever think about what happens next?" I asked quietly, my voice laced with a vulnerability I hadn't dared show before. He looked at me, his gaze softening as he reached out to brush a hand along my cheek. "Every day, and I know that no matter what happens, I don't want to lose this." His words filled me with a sense of reassurance, a belief that maybe, somehow, we could find a way to make this work. And as I drifted off to sleep beside him, I felt a strange sense of peace, a sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. But as the days went on, the reality of our situation began to creep in, filling the spaces between us with an unspoken tension. We both knew that our secret couldn't last forever, that sooner or later we would have to confront the people in our lives and face the consequences of our choices. Finally, one evening, as we sat together in my apartment, Liam turned to me, his expression filled with a quiet determination. "I think it's time we told Daniel," he said, his voice steady but laced with a hint of nervousness. I nodded, feeling a surge of fear twist in my chest, but I knew he was right. We couldn't keep hiding forever, and if we wanted to build something real, we had to face the truth. The decision to tell Daniel settled over us like a shadow, a weight that we couldn't ignore any longer. For all the joy and warmth that being with Liam brought, there was an underlying current of anxiety, a tension that came from knowing we were holding on to a secret that could shatter friendships, trust, and years of connection. The reality of what was at stake made each step forward feel heavier, yet I knew that we couldn't keep running from it. If we wanted a future together, we'd have to face this. A few days later, we invited Daniel over for dinner, planning to tell him after we'd spent some time together. The evening was warm and comfortable, filled with laughter and the familiarity of old memories, but beneath the surface I could feel the nervous energy radiating from Liam and myself. Daniel was in high spirits, completely unaware of the storm brewing in our silence, oblivious to the tension in the shared glances between Liam and me. After dinner, we sat around, sipping drinks and catching up, and I could feel Liam growing more anxious as the minutes passed. Finally, as a lull settled over the conversation, he cleared his throat, glancing at me with a look that told me it was time. "Daniel," he began, his voice steady but strained, "there's something I need to tell you. Something we need to tell you." Daniel looked between us, his brow furrowing slightly as he picked up on the seriousness in Liam's tone. "What is it?" he asked, setting his drink down, his gaze shifting between us with a hint of curiosity and concern. Liam took a deep breath, his hand subtly reaching for mine under the table, a quiet gesture of reassurance that steadied me. "This isn't easy to say, but I need you to know that over the past few months, we've gotten closer than just friends." A moment of silence fell over the room, and I watched as Daniel's expression shifted from confusion to shock, his gaze lingering on our joined hands. His mouth opened, then closed, as though he were struggling to process what he was seeing, what he was hearing. "Wait, you're telling me, you and him?" he said slowly, his voice barely more than a whisper as he tried to make sense of the revelation. I nodded, my throat tight with anxiety. "Yes, Daniel. It wasn't planned, and it's not something we took lightly, but it's real, and we both care about you enough to be honest." Daniel sat back, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the floor, a mix of emotions flickering across his face. I don't know what to say," he murmured, his voice filled with confusion, perhaps even betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "We wanted to be sure first," Liam replied softly, his tone filled with sincerity. "We didn't want to risk hurting you if we weren't certain about what this was. But now, we're certain." The silence that followed was heavy, tense. I could see the hurt in Daniel's expression, the shock and disbelief that came from realizing his best friend and his brother had kept something so significant from him. Part of me wanted to reach out, to say something that would make it all better, but I knew that nothing could soften the blow of a revelation like this. Finally, Daniel looked up, his gaze shifting between us. I never saw this coming. You're my brother, Liam, and you're my best friend," he said, his voice tinged with a raw vulnerability that tore at me. "This isn't easy for me to process." "I know," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "I know this is a lot, and we don't expect you to be okay with it right away. We just wanted you to hear it from us." Daniel nodded slowly, his expression softening as he took in our words. He sat in silence for a few moments, clearly grappling with the weight of it all before he finally looked up, his gaze meeting mine. "I need some time," he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "This changes everything, but I don't want to lose either of you. So, just give me time to process it." A wave of relief washed over me, and I nodded, my hand squeezing Liam's as I took in Daniel's words. "Take all the time you need," I murmured, my voice filled with gratitude. "We're here whenever you're ready." Daniel offered a small, strained smile, then rose from his seat, giving us both a nod before making his way to the door. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of the emotions he was carrying, and I knew that this was only the beginning of a difficult road ahead. As the door closed behind him, Liam let out a shaky breath, his hand tightening around mine. "That was harder than I thought," he murmured, his voice filled with a mix of relief and sadness. I nodded, feeling a surge of emotion rise within me. "But we did it. We're finally free of the secrecy." He turned to me, a small, tentative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Thank you for standing by me, for being willing to take this risk." I reached out, my hand settling on his cheek, a soft, reassuring gesture that grounded us both. "There's no one else I'd rather face this with," I replied, my voice filled with a quiet certainty. We sat together in the stillness that followed, letting the weight of the moment settle over us, a mixture of hope and uncertainty filling the spaces between us. There was no guarantee of what lay ahead, no promise that the road would be easy, but as we held each other, I knew that we were ready to face whatever challenges came our way, together.